Sometimes life strips away everything you hold dear, leaving you with nothing but the courage to make one last stand. When the flames took Lydia Mae Dawson's family farm, she lost more than her home. She lost her entire world. Now winter was coming to Devil's Backbone Ridge, and she had nowhere to go. Ephraim Boone was splitting logs outside his ranch when this desperate woman appeared at his gate. He was a giant of a man, 6'6", and built like an oak tree. Folks said he was mean and cursed. But Lydia looked up at him and made the boldest promise of her life. "Give me a home, sir, and I'll give you 10 sons." What happened next would change both their lives forever. But would this desperate bargain save them both, or destroy everything they'd ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the steady thunk of Ephraim's axe biting into wood. Lydia Mae Dawson stood there in her threadbare shawl, the fabric so worn it was nearly transparent in places, waiting for an answer that might determine whether she'd see another sunrise. Ephraim Boone set down his axe with deliberate care, wiping his hands on a leather apron that had seen better decades. Up close, he was even more imposing than the stories suggested. His shoulders filled the doorframe of the barn behind him, and his hands lowered. His hands were the size of dinner plates, scarred and calloused from years of hard living. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Steel grey, like storm clouds gathering over the mountains, and old, too old for a man who couldn't be more than 35. 10 sons, he repeated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "That's a mighty specific number, miss." Lydia's chin lifted despite the tremor in her voice. "It's what a man needs to work a spread this size proper. Strong backs, willing hands." She gestured toward the vast expanse of land that rolled away from them in all directions, dotted with cattle that looked like specks against the endless brown grass. "I've got good bloodlines. My grandmother bore 12 children, all healthy. My mother had 8 before the consumption took her." The wind picked up, cutting through her thin dress like a blade. She'd been walking for 3 days since the fire, living on creek water and whatever berries she could find. Her stomach felt hollow as a drum, but she kept her shoulders square and her gaze steady. Ephraim studied her with those unsettling eyes, taking in details she wasn't sure she wanted him to see. The soot still caught in her hair, despite her attempts to wash it out in the stream. The blisters on her feet from walking in shoes never meant for such distance. The way she favored her left side, where a falling beam had caught her ribs during her escape from the flames. "You got a name?" he asked finally. "Lydia Mae Dawson. My father was Samuel Dawson, had the farm about 20 miles southeast of here, near Cedar Creek." Her voice caught slightly on the past tense, but she pushed through. "Had it for 32 years before." She stopped, unable to finish. "I heard about the fire." Ephraim's tone softened just a fraction. "Heard it took most everything in that valley. I'm sorry for your loss." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She'd been holding herself together through sheer determination, but sympathy was a luxury she couldn't afford. If she broke down now, she might never get back up. "I don't need pity," she said quickly. "I need work. I need a roof. I need a chance to earn my keep. What makes you think I need a wife?" The blunt question hit her like a physical blow. "Every man needs, that is, the Bible says." "Bible says a lot of things. Doesn't mean I follow all of them." He picked up his axe again, testing the weight of it in his hands. "I've gotten along fine on my own for 8 years. What makes you think that's about to change?" 8 years. Lydia filed that information away, wondering what had happened 8 years ago to drive him into solitude. The folks in town had been full of stories about Ephraim Boone. They said he'd come to Devil's Backbone Ridge with nothing but the clothes on his back and a look in his eyes that kept decent people from asking too many questions. They said he'd built his ranch with his own 2 hands, every fence post and beam, working from sunrise to sunset until he'd carved out one of the finest spreads in 3 counties. They also said he was cursed, that he'd loved a woman once, back east, and when she died, something in him died too. The old-timers claimed he'd made some kind of bargain with dark forces, trading his soul for the strength to survive out here alone. The younger folks just said he was mean as a rattler and twice as likely to bite. Looking at him now, Lydia could see why the stories had grown in the telling. There was something untamed about him, something that belonged more to the wilderness than to civilization. His dark hair fell past his collar, and his beard was trimmed but thick. His clothes were clean but practical worn leather pants, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, boots that had walked 1,000 miles of hard ground. But it was more than his size or his appearance that set him apart. There was a quality of stillness about him, like a mountain lake before a storm. He didn't fidget or fill silence with unnecessary words. He simply existed, solid and unmovable as granite. "Maybe you don't need a wife," Lydia said carefully, "but you need help. This place is too big for one man, no matter how strong. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend animals. I was a schoolteacher before I can read and write and cipher. I know medicinal herbs and how to preserve food for winter. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Boone. I'm offering a fair trade." "And the 10 sons?" Heat flooded her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "A woman can't make such promises alone. That would need—" "I know what it would need." His voice was dry as dust. "Question is whether you've thought it through. Marriage isn't just sharing a bed, Miss Dawson. It's sharing everything. Good times and bad, sickness and health, plenty and want. You're talking about tying yourself to a man you've known for all of 10 minutes. "I'm talking about surviving," she shot back, surprising herself with the force in her voice. "You think I have choices here? You think I came to your door because I was feeling romantic?" She gestured toward the mountains that ringed the valley, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Winter's coming. I've got no money, no family, no place to go. In 3 weeks, maybe less, these mountains will be snowed in until spring. If I'm not settled somewhere by then, I'll freeze to death before Christmas." The truth of it hung between them, stark and undeniable. Ephraim set down his axe again and rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that made him seem more human somehow. 10 sons, he said again, but this time there was something almost like amusement in his voice. "You don't aim small, do you? My grandmother used to say that if you're going to dream, you might as well dream big." Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. She also used to say that the Lord helps those who help themselves, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is take a leap of faith and trust that the ground will rise up to meet you. Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if he could read her entire life story there. Finally, he nodded toward the cabin that sat about 50 yards from the barn, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin grey line. "I've got stew on the stove," he said. "You look like you could use a hot meal." It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Lydia followed him across the yard, her legs suddenly shaky with relief and exhaustion. The cabin was bigger than it had looked from a distance, built from logs that had been carefully chinked and weatherproofed. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, and the roof was steep enough to shed snow efficiently. Inside, the single large room was spare but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cookstove nearby and shelves lined with books. A sturdy table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a narrow bed was pushed against the far wall. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but there was something almost austere about it, as if the cabin's owner had deliberately avoided anything that might be considered decorative or welcoming. Except for the rocking chair. It sat near the fireplace, beautifully carved from what looked like cherry wood, with intricate scrollwork on the arms and back. A small cushion covered in faded blue fabric rested on the seat, and the wood gleamed with the patina of careful maintenance, despite showing no signs of use. Lydia found herself staring at it, wondering who it had been made for, and why it sat empty in a bachelor's cabin. "Sit," Ephraim said, ladling stew into a bowl. "You can take the chair at the table." The stew was simple but hearty beef and vegetables in a rich broth that tasted like heaven after 3 days of near starvation. Lydia ate slowly, trying to make it last, while Ephraim sat across from her with his own bowl. He didn't seem inclined to conversation, but his presence was oddly comforting. There was something steadying about him, something that made her feel safer than she had since the night of the fire. "This is good," she said finally. "Thank you." He nodded, then surprised her by asking, "What happened to your folks? In the fire, I mean." The spoon trembled in her hand, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "They were already gone. Papa died 2 years back from a bad heart, and Mama followed 6 months later. Said she couldn't bear to be parted from him any longer." She took a shaky breath. "I stayed on to keep the farm going, but it was too much for one person. I was thinking about selling, maybe moving to Denver to find teaching work, when the fire came through." "No other family?" "None that would claim me. Papa's people back in Missouri never approved of him marrying beneath his station, and Mama's folks were all gone before I was born." She set down her spoon, no longer hungry despite the hollow ache in her belly. "I'm alone in the world, Mr. Boone, completely and utterly alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth and pain. Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, then pushed back from the table and walked to the window that looked out over his land. "I came here 8 years ago with nothing but what I could carry," he said finally. "Built this place from scratch, turned wild land into something productive. It's good land, rich soil, plenty of water, grass that grows thick and sweet. But it's hard country too. Winters that'll freeze the marrow in your bones, summers that'll bake you dry as leather, storms that come out of nowhere and tear apart everything you've built." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Loneliness, bone-deep, soul-crushing loneliness that matched her own. "I've never taken a wife because I've never met a woman who could handle this life. City women take one look at the isolation and run screaming back to civilization. Country women, well, most of them have sense enough not to tie themselves to a man with my reputation." "What reputation is that?" His smile was grim. "Depends who you ask. Some say I'm cursed. Others say I'm just mean. A few claim I killed a man back east and came here to hide from the law." "What do you say?" "I say a man's past is his own business, and the only thing that matters is what he does with the days he has left." Lydia considered that, turning the words over in her mind like stones in a creek bed. "I don't care what you've done or where you've come from, Mr. Boone. I care whether you're the kind of man who'd honor a bargain fairly made. And if I am," she met his eyes squarely, "then I'll give you 10 sons or die trying." The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different, charged with possibility and something that might have been hope. Finally, Ephraim walked back to the table and sat down across from her. "I can't promise you love, Miss Dawson. I'm not sure I remember how to feel such things anymore. But I can promise you a roof over your head, food on the table, and protection from whatever troubles might come calling. I can promise to treat you with respect and never raise a hand to you in anger. And I can promise that any children we might have will be wanted and cared for." "That's more than most women get," Lydia said quietly. "It's enough." "Is it? Because once you make this choice, there's no going back. This isn't Denver, where you can catch a train if you change your mind. Come winter, we'll be snowbound for months. If you decide you've made a mistake, you'll have to live with it until spring." She thought about that, really thought about it, pictured herself trapped in this isolated cabin with a man she barely knew, no way to leave, no one to turn to if things went wrong. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the night her world burned down. "Peace." "I understand," she said, "and I accept your terms." Ephraim nodded slowly. "Then I reckon we'd better get you properly settled. You can have the bed tonight. I'll make a place for myself by the fire." "That's not necessary." "It is until we're properly wed. I may not be a church-going man, Miss Dawson, but I'm not a heathen either. We'll do this right." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lydia helped Ephraim clear the dishes and prepare for the night. It was a simple domestic scene, but there was something profound about it too. Two lonely souls finding shelter in each other's company, making the best of circumstances neither had chosen but both were willing to accept. Later, as she lay in Ephraim's narrow bed listening to him move quietly around the cabin, Lydia thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she'd been a woman with nothing to lose. Now she was promised to a man who might be her salvation or her doom, committed to a bargain that would bind them together, for better or worse. 10 sons. The promise echoed in her mind as sleep finally claimed her. It was a bold vow, perhaps even a foolish one. But as her grandmother used to say, sometimes the best thing you can do is take a leap of faith and trust that the ground will rise up to meet you. Outside, the wind whispered through the mountains, carrying the scent of coming snow and the promise of a winter that would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Dawn broke cold and clear over Devil's Backbone Ridge, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Lydia woke to the sound of Ephraim moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire and starting coffee. She lay still for a moment, adjusting to the reality of her new circumstances. Yesterday seemed like a dream or perhaps a fever vision brought on by exhaustion and desperation. But the scent of coffee was real enough, and so was the warmth radiating from the fireplace. She sat up carefully, smoothing her wrinkled dress and trying to finger-comb her hair into some semblance of order. In the harsh light of morning, her situation felt both more real and more impossible than it had the night before. "Morning," Ephraim said without turning around. He stood at the stove with his back to her, broad shoulders filling out a clean flannel shirt. "Coffee's almost ready." "Thank you." She swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as her feet touched the cold floor. "I should be the one making breakfast, if I'm to earn my keep." "You're not my servant, Miss Dawson. We're partners in this arrangement, remember?" Partners. The word settled something in her chest that she hadn't realized was twisted tight. She'd spent so many years caring for her aging parents, running the farm, managing everything alone, that the idea of sharing responsibility felt foreign and wonderful. Ephraim handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. His hands were warm despite the morning chill, and calloused in a way that spoke of honest work. "There's biscuits from last night if you're hungry." The coffee was strong and black, exactly what she needed to chase away the lingering wisps of sleep. She cupped the mug in both hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers while she studied her strange new partner. In daylight, he seemed less forbidding somehow, though no less impressive. His dark hair was neatly combed, his beard trimmed, and his clothes clean. Whatever his reputation might be, he clearly took pride in his appearance. "I should probably explain something about the way things work here," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "This ranch runs on routine. Cattle need tending, equipment needs maintaining, and winter preparations can't wait for sentiment. If we're going to make this partnership work, you'll need to understand that some days the work comes first." "I understand. I grew up on a farm, remember? I know that animals don't care if you're tired or sick or heartbroken. They need what they need when they need it." Something flickered in his eyes, approval perhaps, or relief. "Good. Because today I need to ride out and check the south pasture. Been hearing wolves in that direction, and I can't afford to lose any cattle this close to winter. I'll come with you." He shook his head. "Not today. You're still recovering from your journey, and I move fast when I'm working. Besides," he gestured toward her dress, which was practical enough for town but hardly suitable for ranch work, "you'll need proper clothes before you can ride with me." Lydia looked down at her dress, seeing it through his eyes. The fabric was good quality, but it was a town dress, meant for teaching school and attending church socials. The skirt was full enough to ride side saddle, but it would be impractical for the kind of hard work a ranch demanded. "I don't have anything else," she admitted. "Everything I owned burned in the fire." Ephraim was quiet for a moment, then stood and walked to a large trunk tucked under the window. He opened it carefully, as if it contained something precious or painful. From inside, He lifted a bundle of women's clothing, Lydia realized with a start. These belong to... He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. They should fit well enough, at least until we can get to town and buy you proper things. The clothes were beautiful, clearly made by skilled hands from good fabric. A riding skirt in dark blue wool, several blouses in white and cream cotton, a warm woolen shawl. Everything was perfectly preserved, as if it had been waiting for someone to claim it. Whose were they? Lydia asked gently. Ephraim's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Someone who had no further use for them. It wasn't really an answer, but the pain in his voice told her not to press. Whatever woman had owned these clothes, she'd left a mark on Ephraim Boone that time hadn't healed. The realization should have made Lydia feel awkward or jealous, but instead she felt a deep sympathy. She knew what it was like to lose someone important, to be left with only belongings that carried the ghost of their presence. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll take good care of them." While Ephraim saddled his horse and prepared for his ride, Lydia changed into the riding clothes. They fit almost perfectly, as if they'd been made for her. The fabric was soft from wear but well maintained, and the cut was both practical and flattering. Whoever the previous owner had been, she'd had excellent taste. From the window, she watched Ephraim mount his horsey big bay gelding that matched his owner's impressive size and ride out toward the southern pastures. He sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, moving with the easy grace of a man completely at home in his environment. Alone in the cabin, Lydia took the opportunity to really look around. The space was larger than it had seemed the night before, with good light from several windows and thoughtful touches that spoke of permanent residence rather than temporary shelter. The books on the shelves were an eclectic mix of practical volumes on ranching and animal husbandry, alongside classics of literature and philosophy. Someone had made an effort to create a real home here, not just a place to sleep and eat. But it was the rocking chair that drew her attention again and again. She circled it like a nervous cat, taking in the exquisite craftsmanship. Every line was perfect, every joint seamless. The wood had been polished to a deep, rich glow, and the seat cushion showed no signs of wear despite its age. Finally, unable to resist, she sat down and began to rock gently. The motion was smooth and soothing, the rhythm hypnotic. As she rocked, she noticed something tucked between the cushion and the chair's armor, small bundle wrapped in faded yellow silk. Her hands shook slightly as she unwrapped it, revealing a charred family Bible. The leather cover was blackened in places, and some of the pages were singed at the edges, but it was unmistakably hers. The Bible her grandmother had given her mother, who had passed it down to Lydia on her 18th birthday. She pressed it to her chest, tears flowing freely for the first time since the fire. She'd thought it was lost forever, consumed in the flames along with everything else from her old life. But here it was, somehow saved from the destruction. Inside the front cover, pressed between thin sheets of paper, were the flowers she'd collected over the years, wildflowers from special occasions, roses from her mother's funeral, violets from the last Easter she'd spent with both parents. The family records were there too, written in her grandmother's careful script. Births, deaths, marriages, a chronicle of the Dawson family stretching back 3 generations. At the bottom of the page, in her own handwriting, was the entry for her parents' deaths. Below that, nothing but blank lines waiting to be filled. "I wondered if you'd find that." Lydia looked up to see Ephraim standing in the doorway, having returned from his ride without her hearing him approach. His expression was unreadable, but there was something gentle in his voice. Where did you find it?" "Rode past your place the day after the fire. Most everything was ash and charcoal, but I found that Bible caught in a tree about 100 yards from where your house used to stand. Wind must have carried it clear during the blaze." He stepped into the cabin, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Figured somebody ought to save it, just in case." "You saved it." The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "You saved the only thing I had left of my family." Ephraim shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to gratitude. Seemed like the right thing to do. Bible like that. It means something. has weight to it beyond just paper and leather. Lydia stood up from the rocking chair, still clutching the Bible. Why didn't you tell me last night, when I said I had nothing left? You were barely holding yourself together as it was, figured it could wait until you were stronger. The thoughtfulness of the gesture hit her like a physical blow. This Manthis, supposedly cursed, mean, solitary man had taken the time to search through the wreckage of her life and save the one thing that would matter most to her. More than that, he'd waited until she was ready to receive it, understanding instinctively that such a gift required the right moment. The wolves, she managed to ask, trying to regain her composure. False alarm, found tracks, but they were old, probably moved on to easier hunting. He paused, studying her face. You all right? No, she wasn't all right. She was overwhelmed and grateful and confused and terrified all at once. She was sitting in a dead woman's chair, wearing a dead woman's clothes, promised to a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. But she was also safe and fed, and no longer completely alone in the world. I'm well enough, she said finally. Thank you. For everything. Ephraim nodded once, then moved toward the kitchen area. I'll start lunch. We need to talk about practical matters, when we'll go to town, what supplies you'll need, how to arrange for a proper wedding. A proper wedding. I told you last night we'll do this right. That means standing before a preacher and making proper vows, the kind that'll satisfy the law and any gossips who might have opinions about our arrangement. Lydia sank back into the rocking chair, the Bible still pressed against her chest. A proper wedding, vows made before God and witnesses. It would make their bargain real in a way that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. When? She asked. Soon as we can arrange it. Winter's coming fast, and I'd rather have everything settled before the snows start in earnest. He pulled ingredients from the cupboard with efficient movements. There's a preacher in Bent Creek who'll marry us without asking too many questions. We can ride there Saturday if the weather holds. Saturday. That was 4 days away. 4 days to prepare for a wedding to a man who freely admitted he couldn't promise love, only shelter and protection. 4 days to transform herself from a desperate refugee into a rancher's wife. But as she rocked gently in the chair that had been waiting for a woman who never came, her grandmother's Bible safe in her hands, Lydia felt something she hadn't experienced since before her parents died. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the absence of despair. Outside, the wind whispered through the mountains, carrying the scent of coming snow and the promise of a winter that would test them both. But inside the cabin, warmth radiated from the fireplace, and the smell of cooking food filled the air. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Lydia Mae Dawson was home. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and cautious discovery. Lydia threw herself into learning the rhythms of ranch life with the same determination that had helped her manage her family's farm after her father's death. She rose before dawn to help with morning chores, spent her days cleaning and organizing the cabin, and fell into bed each night exhausted but oddly satisfied. Ephraim was a man of few words, but he was a patient teacher. He showed her how to milk the cow, gather eggs from the temperamental hens, and tend the kitchen garden that provided vegetables for their table. His hands were gentle when he guided her through unfamiliar tasks, and his approval expressed in nods and occasional good, or that's right, meant more to her than she cared to admit. The more time she spent with him, the more the stories about his supposed cruelty seemed like exactly that stories. Yes, he was imposing and often stern, but she'd seen him spend an hour coaxing a spooked calf back to its mother and watched him carefully tend a horse with a stone bruise. Whatever darkness lived in his past, it hadn't touched the core of who he was. Still, there were moments when she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had too many missing pieces. And sometimes, late at night when she lay in his bed listening to him move around the cabin, she wondered what thoughts kept him awake and staring into the fire. On Thursday morning, while cleaning the cabin more thoroughly than it had probably been cleaned in years, Lydia discovered something that stopped her in her tracks. In the drawer of the small table beside the bed, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, lay a man's wedding ring. The band was simple but well made, crafted from gold that had darkened with age. Inside, an inscription read, "E.B. Forever Yours, M.L." The letters were worn but still legible, and the ring itself showed signs of having been handled frequently, as if someone had taken it out and held it many times over the years. Lydia stared at the ring for a long moment, her mind racing. E.B. Ephraim Boone. But who was M.L., and why did he keep a wedding ring hidden in his drawer like some kind of talisman? The sound of boots on the porch made her quickly wrap the ring and return it to its place. By the time Ephraim entered the cabin, she was innocently dusting the shelves, though her heart was beating fast enough to power a steam engine. "Find everything you need?" he asked, hanging his hat on its peg. "Yes, thank you. The cabin's in better shape than most houses I've seen. Someone's taken good care of it." Something flickered across his face, pain maybe, or regret. It served its purpose. That afternoon, as they worked together preparing vegetables for dinner, Lydia found herself studying Ephraim's hands. They were strong and capable, scarred from years of hard work, but there was no tan line where a wedding band might have rested. Whatever story the ring held, it wasn't a recent one. "Tell me about your family," she said, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Ephraim's knife paused in its steady rhythm of chopping carrots. "Not much to tell. Parents died when I was young. Grew up in an orphanage back in Pennsylvania. No brothers or sisters. None that I know of." He resumed chopping, his movements perhaps a bit more forceful than necessary. "Like I said, not much to tell." But there was more to tell. Lydia could sense it in the way his shoulders tensed, the careful neutrality of his voice. The ring in the drawer suggested a story much more complex than a simple orphaned boy making his way west. "What about you?" he asked, clearly trying to redirect the conversation. "Any family traditions I should know about? Things that matter to you?" Lydia thought about that, absently fingering the corner of her apron. "My grandmother always said that a house isn't a home until it has something growing in it. She kept flowers everywhere, window boxes, garden plots, even little pots on the kitchen table in winter. That so?" She said flowers reminded folks that beautiful things could grow, even in the hardest ground, if you gave them enough care and attention. Ephraim was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's a shed out behind the barn where I keep tools and supplies. Might be some flower seeds in there from before. You're welcome to whatever you can find." The casual offer made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. It was such a small thing, but it felt like acceptance, like he was giving her permission to put down roots, to make this place truly hers. That evening, after dinner, she ventured out to the shed he'd mentioned. It was larger than she'd expected, well organized and filled with everything needed to maintain a working ranch. But in one corner, covered with dust and clearly untouched for years, sat a collection of gardening supplies. There were hand tools, clay pots, and just as Ephraim had suggested, packets of flower seeds. Morning glories, sweet peas, zinnias, and roses. The packets were old, and some of the seeds might no longer be viable, but the possibility they represented made her heart sing. As she gathered the supplies, something else caught her eye. Pushed back against the wall, almost hidden behind a stack of lumber, was a wooden cradle. Like everything else Ephraim made, it was beautifully crafted, with smooth lines and careful joinery. But unlike his other work, this piece was unfinished. The wood was sanded smooth but not stained, and there were pencil marks where decorative elements had been planned but never carved. Lydia ran her fingers along the cradle's edge, imagining the hands that had shaped it and the hopes that had guided its creation. Somewhere in this ranch's past, someone had prepared for a baby that had never come. The realization made her throat tight with sympathy for all the dreams that had withered and died in this beautiful, lonely place. Finding what you need? She spun around to find Ephraim standing in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the evening sky. How did a man that size move so quietly? "Yes, thank you. The seeds, they're perfect." She gestured toward the packets in her hands, then couldn't help glancing back at the cradle. "This is beautiful work." His face went carefully blank. Started it a long time ago. Never had reason to finish it. The woman who owned the clothes, Lydia said softly. Was she were you planning to? That's not a conversation for tonight, Ephraim said, his voice gentle but firm. We've got a wedding to think about. Saturday's coming whether we're ready or not. He was right, of course. Saturday, their wedding day, was only 2 days away. Tomorrow they would ride to Bent Creek to make arrangements with the preacher, and then she would be Mrs. Ephraim Boone, bound to this man and this land, by vows that couldn't be easily broken. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with something that might have been anticipation. Ephraim, she said as they walked back toward the cabin together. About our arrangement about the 10 sons. What about it? She felt heat rise in her cheeks but forced herself to continue. I want you to know that I understand what I promised. I'm not some silly girl who thinks babies come from kissing under the mistletoe. I know what's required, and I'm prepared for it. They'd reached the cabin porch, and Ephraim stopped walking. In the fading light, his expression was unreadable, but his voice was serious when he spoke. Lydia, I need you to understand something. When we marry it won't just be about fulfilling your promise. A marriage bed isn't a business transaction, no matter how the union starts. When that time comes, it needs to be something we both want, not just something you feel obligated to endure. The consideration in his words, the respect implicit in them, made her eyes burn with unexpected tears. How many women in her situation could expect such thoughtfulness from the men who claimed them? I understand, she said quietly, and too grateful for your patience. You don't need to be grateful, you just need to be sure. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. Because once we speak those vows, I'll want a real marriage eventually. Not just companionship or convenience, but something more. If you can't see yourself wanting that someday with Methan, we should call this off now. Lydia looked up at him, this giant of a man who could probably break her in half without effort, but who spoke to her with such gentle consideration. In the growing darkness, his eyes looked almost black, but there was nothing frightening about them. Instead, she saw patience and loneliness and something that might have been hope. I can see it, she said, the words barely more than a whisper. Someday, when we know each other better, when we're ready. Ephraim nodded slowly, then reached out to touch her cheek with one calloused finger. The contact was brief and light, but it sent warmth shooting through her entire body. Then we'll take it slow, he said. One day at a time until we're both ready. As they went inside and prepared for another night of careful distancing by the fire, her in his bed, Lydia found herself thinking about the ring hidden in the drawer and the unfinished cradle gathering dust in the shed. Whatever had broken Ephraim's heart before, whatever dreams had died in this place, she was determined not to let history repeat itself. Tomorrow they would ride to town and arrange their wedding. Saturday they would speak vows that would bind them together. But tonight she would lie in his bed and imagine a future where the cradle in the shed wasn't a monument to loss, but a promise of hope to come. Friday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for their trip to Bent Creek. Lydia woke to the sound of Ephraim moving around the cabin, preparing for their journey. Today they would arrange their wedding, make their private agreement public and legal. The thought made her stomach flutter with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. She'd chosen to wear the blue wool riding outfit from the trunk, paired with a cream-colored blouse that brought out the color in her eyes. It felt strange to dress with such care for a man she barely knew, but if she was going to become Mrs. Ephraim Boone, she wanted to look the part. You look fine, Ephraim said, when she emerged from behind the privacy screen where she'd changed. His voice was gruff, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel genuinely pretty for the first time in months. Thank you. You clean up well yourself. He'd traded his usual work clothes for dark trousers and a white shirt, with a black vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was neatly combed and his beard trimmed. He looked like what he was, successful rancher, a man of substance and respectability. The ride to Bent Creek took most of the morning. Ephraim had saddled a gentle mare for Lydia, and she was grateful for both the horse's calm temperament and the side saddle that made riding in skirts possible. As they traveled, he pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the land, his voice growing easier the farther they got from the ranch. "That ridge there, that's where I spent my first winter. Lived in a tent for 3 months while I built the cabin." He gestured toward a rocky outcropping about half a mile to the north. "Thought I was going to freeze to death at least a dozen times." "What made you choose this particular spot?" "Water, mostly. Creek runs year-round, never freezes completely, even in the worst cold. Plus the valley's sheltered from the worst winds, and there's good grazing for cattle." He paused, then added, "And it was far enough from everything else that a man could disappear if he needed to." "Did you need to disappear?" Ephraim was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Sometimes a man makes mistakes that follow him around like shadows. Starting over somewhere new it gives you a chance to become who you really are, instead of who your mistakes made you." Before she could ask what kind of mistakes he meant, they crested a hill and Bent Creek spread out below them. It was a small town, maybe 300 people, but it looked prosperous and well-maintained. A church spire rose above the other buildings, and smoke drifted from dozens of chimneys. "Pretty place," Lydia said. "Good people mostly, keep to themselves. Don't ask too many questions about a man's past." He guided his horse down the slope toward the main street. "Preacher's name is Samuel Matthews. Known him for about 5 years. He's fair and honest, won't give us any trouble about the speed of this arrangement." The church was a simple wooden structure painted white, with clear glass windows and a bell tower that looked like it had been added as an afterthought. Reverend Matthews was working in a small garden beside the building when they arrived, carefully tending to what looked like the last tomatoes of the season. He was a small, neat man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. When he saw them approaching, he set down his gardening tools and walked over with a welcoming smile. "Ephraim, good to see you, son, and this must be the young lady I've been hearing whispers about. Reverend Matthews, this is Miss Lydia Mae Dawson. We'd like to arrange a wedding for tomorrow, if that's possible." The preacher's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Tomorrow? That's rather short notice." "Yes, sir. But the circumstances, Miss Dawson lost everything in the fire over near Cedar Creek, and winter's coming fast. We think it's best not to delay." Reverend Matthews studied them both with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd counseled couples for decades. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. "I see. Well, marriage is a serious undertaking, not something to be entered into lightly. Have you both given this proper consideration?" "We have," Lydia said, speaking up for the first time. "I understand this might seem rushed, but we're both of age and sound mind. We know what we're committing to." "Very well. Come inside, and we'll discuss the arrangements." The church interior was simple but beautiful, with hand-carved pews and windows that cast rainbow patterns across the wooden floor. Reverend Matthews led them to his small office, where he pulled out a leather-bound ledger and began asking questions. "Full names, ages, any previous marriages?" "Ephraim James Boone, 34, never married," Ephraim said. "Lydia Mae Dawson, 26, never married," Lydia added. "Any family who should be notified?" They looked at each other, and Lydia felt a pang of sadness. "None living," she said simply. "Witnesses? I'll need at least 2. "I can arrange that," Ephraim said. "Tom Carson and his wife live just outside town. They'll stand for us." The preacher made notes in his careful script, then looked up at them seriously. "Now, I have to scare you both entering this marriage of your own free will. No coercion or undue pressure." "Yes, sir," they said in unison. "Miss Dawson, are you certain this is what you want? Marriage is a sacred covenant, not a business arrangement. If you're feeling pressured by your circumstances—" "I'm not," Lydia said firmly. "Mr. Boone has been nothing but respectful and honest with me. This is my choice." Reverend Matthews nodded, apparently satisfied. "Very well. The ceremony will be at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon." That will give me time to prepare and for you to arrange witnesses and any other details you might need." As they left the church, Lydia felt a strange mix of relief and unreality. Tomorrow at this time, she would be a married woman. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "We should get you a proper dress," Ephraim said as they walked down the main street. "Something special for the occasion." "The blue dress is fine." "No," his voice was gentle but firm. "Every woman deserves a proper wedding dress, even if the circumstances aren't conventional. We'll find something suitable." The general store was larger than she'd expected, with bolts of fabric, ready-made clothing, and all manner of goods. The proprietor, a plump woman with a friendly manner, took one look at them and immediately understood their mission. "A wedding dress, how wonderful! Let me see what we have that might work." She pulled out several options: a cream-colored dress with delicate lace trim, a soft blue gown with pearl buttons, and a simple but elegant dress in dove grey. Lydia's hands went immediately to the grey dress. It was beautiful but practical, the kind of dress a rancher's wife might wear to church or special occasions long after her wedding day. "That one," she said softly. "Try it on, dear. The fitting room is just behind that curtain." The dress fit as if it had been made for her, the fabric draping perfectly, and the color bringing out the blue in her eyes. When she emerged from the fitting room, she saw something flicker in Ephraim's expression: surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she managed to say, "Thank you." While Ephraim paid for the dress and arranged for any necessary alterations to be completed by morning, Lydia found herself drawn to a display of small household items. Kitchen tools, linens, decorative objects that would make a house feel more like a home. "See something you like?" the shopkeeper asked. "These," Lydia said, pointing to a collection of small clay pots, perfect for starting flower seeds. "How much?" "For a new bride. Consider them a wedding gift." Before leaving town, they stopped at the hotel for lunch. It was the first time Lydia had eaten in a restaurant since before her parents died, and the simple pleasure of being served food she hadn't cooked herself felt almost luxurious. "Nervous?" Ephraim asked as they shared a meal of roast beef and potatoes. "A little. You?" "Some." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want you to know tomorrow. After the ceremony, things don't have to change immediately. We can take time to adjust, to get used to being married before we—" "I know," she said softly. "You've been more than patient with me. It's not about patience, it's about doing things right." On the ride home, they were both quieter than they'd been that morning. The reality of what they were about to do seemed to settle over them like a weight. By this time tomorrow, they would be husband and wife, bound together by vows and law, and whatever feelings might grow between them. When they reached the ranch, Lydia immediately went to work planting the first of her flower seeds in the small clay pots. It was probably too late in the season for them to grow much before winter, but she needed to feel like she was putting down roots, claiming her place in this new life. Ephraim found her there as the sun was setting, kneeling by the cabin's front steps with dirt under her fingernails and hope in her eyes. "My grandmother used to say that planting flowers was an act of faith," she said without looking up. "You put seeds in the ground, not knowing if they'll grow, trusting that with enough care and time, something beautiful will come of it." Sounds like a wise woman. She was. She also used to say that the best things in life, love, family, happiness, they all grow the same way, slowly, with patience and tending. Ephraim knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as he helped her press the last seeds into the dark soil. "Then I reckon we're off to a good start." That night, as Lydia lay in his bed for the last time as an unmarried woman, she thought about the wild rose bush she planned to plant in the spring. Tomorrow she would take vows that would make this place truly her home, and in a few months, when the snows melted and the earth warmed, she would plant something beautiful by their door. A symbol of new life, new hope, new love, taking root in ground that had been fallow for too long. Outside, the wind whispered through the mountains, carrying the promise of change and the sweet possibility of dreams finally finding a place to grow. Saturday afternoon arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the mountains themselves were blessing their union. Lydia stood before the small mirror in the cabin, adjusting the grey dress that would serve as her wedding gown. Her hands shook slightly as she pinned up her hair, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Tom Carson and his wife Mary served as witnesses, along with a handful of townspeople who'd known Ephraim long enough to wish him well. Reverend Matthews spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, the importance of commitment, and the way two lives could become stronger when joined together. When the time came to exchange vows, Ephraim's voice was steady and sure. I, Ephraim James Boone, take you, Lydia Mae Dawson, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to provide for you, protect you, and honor you for all the days of my life. Lydia's voice trembled only slightly as she responded, I, Lydia Mae Dawson, take you, Ephraim James Boone, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to be faithful to you, to support you, and to build a home with you for all the days of my life. The ring Ephraim placed on her finger was simple gold, purchased that morning in town. As it slid into place, Lydia felt something shift inside her chestnut love. Not yet, but the beginning of something that might grow into love, given time and care. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Matthews said with a gentle smile. Ephraim's kiss was soft and brief, respectful rather than passionate, but it sent warmth through her entire body. When they broke apart, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch hope, perhaps, or the first stirring of genuine affection. The small gathering offered congratulations and well wishes before dispersing. Tom Carson clapped Ephraim on the shoulder and declared that it was about time he settled down. Mary Carson hugged Lydia and whispered that she was lucky to have found such a good man, even if he was too stubborn to show his feelings easily. As they rode home in the late afternoon sunshine, both lost in their own thoughts, Lydia found herself studying the gold band on her finger. Mrs. Ephraim Boone. It would take time to get used to the sound of that. Regrets? Ephraim asked quietly. No, she said, surprised to realize it was true. You? None. But that evening, as they settled into their new reality as husband and wife, the awkwardness between them was almost tangible. They moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing a small space. Ephraim insisted she keep the bed, while he continued sleeping by the fire, despite her protests that they were married now and should share sleeping arrangements. When we're ready, he said firmly, not before. The first sign of real trouble came 3 days later, when strangers appeared at their door. Lydia was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard voices from the front yard. Through the window, she could see Ephraim talking to 2 men in expensive suits and city clothes. Their horses were fine animals, well-groomed, and clearly worth more than most people made in a year. Something about the men set her teeth on edge. They had the look of people who were used to getting their way, who saw everything and everyone as potential acquisitions. When one of them pulled out a map and spread it on a makeshift table, pointing at various sections, her unease deepened. Valuable property, Mr. Boone. With the railroad coming through, land values in this area are going to triple, maybe quadruple. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer. Not interested. Ephraim's voice carried clearly on the still air. I told you that the last time you came calling. The last time we offered $50,000. Today I'm authorized to go as high as $75,000. $75,000. Lydia's breath caught. It was more money than she'd ever imagined, enough to buy a mansion in Denver and live like royalty for the rest of their lives. Still not interested, Ephraim said. Mr. Boone, be reasonable. You're just one man with a small operation. The Consolidated Cattle Syndicate has the capital and connections to develop this land properly. Think of the jobs we could create, the prosperity we could bring to this region. I'm thinking of it. That's why I'm saying no. The second man, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. He was older than his companion, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested he wasn't used to hearing the word no. Mr. Boone, I don't think you understand the situation. The railroad is coming whether you cooperate or not. Progress doesn't wait for stubborn ranchers who can't see the bigger picture. You can take our generous offer and walk away wealthy, or you can fight us and lose everything." Ephraim's posture changed subtly, his shoulders squaring in a way that made him seem even larger than usual. "That sounds remarkably like a threat." "It's a reality check. We've already acquired most of the other properties in this valley. You're becoming an island in a sea of progress, Mr. Boone. That's not a comfortable position to be in. Comfortable enough for me." The older man's smile was cold as winter wind. "We'll see about that. Good day, Mr. Boone. We'll be in touch." After the men left, Ephraim stood in the yard for a long time, staring after their dust cloud. When he finally came inside, his expression was troubled. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked. "Enough. They offered you $75,000? "They did. That's an enormous amount of money." "It is." Lydia studied his face, trying to read his thoughts. "Are you tempted?" "No." His answer was immediate and firm. "This land, it's not just property to me. It's home. It's everything I've built, everything I've worked for. I won't sell it to men who see it as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited. Even if it means we could be wealthy, even if it means we could live anywhere we wanted." Ephraim was quiet for a moment, then walked to the window that looked out over his vast holdings. "Lydia, when I came here 8 years ago, I was running from something. This place, this land, it saved me. Gave me purpose, gave me peace. I won't sell that, not for any amount of money." "What were you running from?" He didn't answer immediately, and she thought he might not answer at all. Finally he said, "Failure. Loss. The kind of mistakes that follow a man around like ghosts." He turned to face her. "I was engaged once, back in Pennsylvania, to a woman named Margaret Louise M.L.W.W.W.W.W. She was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, refined, from a good family." The initials from the ring made sense now. Lydia felt her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to listen. "I was young and stupid, and thought I could give her the kind of life she deserved. But I was also ambitious and reckless. I made some bad investments, trusted the wrong people. Lost everything, her father's money, my own savings, even the house we were supposed to live in after the wedding." "What happened?" "She left. Can't say I blamed her. Her father had made it clear that if she married me, she'd be cut off from the family completely. She chose security over love, and I chose pride over fighting for her." He rubbed the back of his neck in the gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "She died in a carriage accident 6 months later. Never got to tell her I was sorry. The ring in the drawer was supposed to be hers. I had it made before everything fell apart. Couldn't bring myself to sell it or throw it away." Lydia felt a pang of sympathy for the young man he'd been, heartbroken and proud, and carrying guilt that wasn't entirely his to bear. "Is that why you came west? To escape the memories?" "Partly. Mostly I came because I couldn't stand being the man I'd become, weak, defeated, living off other people's charity. I wanted to build something with my own hands, something that couldn't be taken away by bad luck or other people's greed. And now these men want to take it away anyway. They can try." His voice hardened. "But I won't make the same mistake twice. I won't let anyone destroy what matters to me." The intensity in his voice made her shiver. She thought about the men who'd visited, their expensive clothes and casual threats, and wondered what kind of power they represented. $75,000 was a fortune, but it was also the kind of money that suggested they had access to much more. What if they don't take no for an answer? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. That night, as they ate dinner and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Lydia found herself thinking about the surveyor's map one of the men had spread out. She'd only gotten a glimpse of it, but it had looked detailed and thorough, the kind of map someone made when they were planning something specific. "Ephraim," she said as they prepared for bed, "when you said they'd acquired most of the other properties in the valley, the Johnson place, the Miller farm, old Pete Harrison's spread, all sold in the last 6 months. For good prices?" "Fair prices, from what I heard. But then again, Those folks were ready to sell. Johnson's getting too old to work his land. Miller's been wanting to move closer to his daughter in California. And Pete never was much of a rancher anyway. But you're different. I'm different. He banked the fire and settled into his bedroll by the hearth. This land is part of me now, Lydia. Selling it would be like cutting off my arm. As she lay in bed listening to him move around the cabin, Lydia thought about the promise she'd made. 10 sons. Children who would grow up on this land, who would inherit not just property, but a legacy of hard work and independence. Children who would carry on what Ephraim had built. But first, they had to survive whatever the consolidated cattle syndicate had planned for those who refused to sell. The next few weeks brought an uneasy peace to Devil's Backbone Ridge. The cattle syndicate didn't return, but their presence lingered like smoke in the air. Ephraim went about his daily routines with watchful eyes, and Lydia found herself scanning the horizon whenever she worked outside. Despite the underlying tension, their marriage began to find its rhythm. They fell into comfortable patterns, Ephraim handling the heavy ranch work, while Lydia managed the household and helped with lighter chores. Their conversations grew easier, punctuated by shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire. It was during one of these evenings, about 3 weeks after their wedding, that Ephraim made a discovery that changed everything. Lydia was mending one of his shirts when he approached with something in his hand, a yellowed piece of paper that looked official and important. "I found this today," he said, settling into the chair across from her. It was tucked behind some books on the shelf, inside an old Bible I haven't opened in years. The paper was a teaching certificate, beautifully decorated with elaborate script and official seals. Miss Lydia Mae Dawson. It read, "Having completed the required coursework and examinations, is hereby certified to teach in the public schools of Colorado Territory." Ephraim studied the document with obvious respect. "This is from the Denver Normal School. That's one of the finest teacher training programs west of the Mississippi." Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd forgotten the certificate was there, tucked away in her grandmother's Bible for safekeeping. "It was my dream once, before my parents got sick and needed care." "You gave up teaching to tend them?" "Someone had to. Papa couldn't work the farm with his heart condition, and Mama was too weak to manage the house. I taught for 2 years after getting my certificate, then came home when they needed me." Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, studying the certificate as if it held secrets. "You could teach again. The children in Bent Creek have been without a proper school teacher for over a year. The last one moved to California with her husband. I'm a rancher's wife now. My place is here. Your place is wherever you can do the most good." He handed the certificate back to her. "Lydia, you have skills, education, talents that shouldn't be wasted. If teaching is what you love, what I love is being here with you." The words came out before she could stop them, surprising them both with their honesty. Ephraim's expression softened. "Even so, the children in town need someone who knows what they're doing. And you need something that's yours, something that has nothing to do with me or this ranch or the promise you made." The idea was tempting, more tempting than she wanted to admit. She'd loved teaching, loved watching young minds discover new ideas and possibilities. But the life of a rancher's wife was demanding, especially as winter approached. How would it work? Bent Creek is too far to travel daily. You could teach 3 days a week, stay in town those nights. I can manage the ranch alone for that long, and it would give you a chance to—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "To have a life outside these mountains. To remember who you were before you became Mrs. Ephraim Boone." The consideration behind his words made her chest tight with emotion. How many husbands would encourage their wives to pursue interests that took them away from home? How many men would put their wives' happiness ahead of their own convenience? "You really wouldn't mind? I'd be proud of you, and proud to be married to the best teacher in 3 counties. That night, Lydia lay awake thinking about the possibility. Teaching again, standing in front of a classroom, helping children learn to read and write and think for themselves. The prospect filled her with excitement she hadn't felt since before her parents' illness. But there was something else keeping her awake tooth, where Ephraim had looked at her when she'd said she loved being with him. Surprise, yes, but also something warmer. Something that looked almost like tenderness. The next morning brought both opportunity and complications. A rider appeared at their door just after breakfast, a young man from town with urgent news. "Mrs. Boone, I'm Tim Bradley. My ma sent me to fetch you. She heard you might be willing to teach, and we've got a situation in town." "What kind of situation?" "3 families just arrived from back east, the Hendersons, the Walkers, and the Pritchards. They've got 8 children between them, all school age. The town council's meeting this afternoon to discuss hiring a teacher before winter sets in proper." Lydia looked at Ephraim, who nodded encouragingly. "Go," he said. "At least hear what they have to offer." The ride to Bent Creek gave her time to think about what she wanted from this opportunity. Teaching had always been more than just a job to herit, was a calling, a way to shape the future, one child at a time. If she took the position, she wanted to do it right. The town council meeting was held in the back room of the general store, with 5 men and 2 women crowded around a small table. They welcomed her warmly, clearly relieved to have found someone with proper credentials. "The position pays $30 a month," explained Mr. Carson, who apparently served as the unofficial chairman. "We can provide a small room above the schoolhouse for nights when you stay in town, and meals with different families on a rotating basis. What about supplies? Books, slates, paper?" "We've got some basics, but not much. The last teacher took most of her materials when she left." Lydia thought about the small inheritance she'd received when her parents died, money she'd been saving for emergencies. "I can contribute towards supplies if needed. Children can't learn without proper materials." The relief on their faces was obvious. After some discussion about schedules and expectations, they offered her the position officially. She would start the following Monday, teaching Tuesday through Thursday each week. As she rode home, Lydia felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She would be a teacher again, using skills she'd feared were lost forever. But she would also be establishing herself in the community as more than just Ephraim's wife. She would be Lydia Boone, educator, a person of standing in her own right. Ephraim was waiting for her when she arrived, clearly eager to hear how things had gone. When she told him about the job offer, his smile was the brightest she'd ever seen from him. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "When do you start?" "Next week. 3 days a week, staying in town Tuesday and Wednesday nights." "Good. That'll give you time to prepare lessons and get to know the families." That evening, as they shared dinner and discussed practical arrangements for her new schedule, Lydia marveled at how much their relationship had evolved. What had started as a desperate bargain was becoming something richer and more complex, a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. After dinner, Ephraim surprised her by producing a small wrapped package. "Early congratulations," he said, almost shyly. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal, the kind teachers used for lesson planning. The cover was embossed with her new initials, LB. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "Thank you. Every teacher needs a proper planning book, and every important journey deserves a record." Later that night, as Ephraim banked the fire and prepared his bedroll, Lydia found herself watching him with new eyes. The man who had seemed so intimidating just weeks ago now moved through their shared space with familiar grace, his presence as comforting as the warmth from the hearth. "Ephraim," she said softly. He looked up from adjusting his blankets. "Yes? When I said I loved being here with you, I meant it. Not just because you saved me from freezing or starving, but because—" she struggled to find the right words. "Because you make me feel like myself again. Like someone worth knowing." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful control he maintained. "Lydia, I know we agreed to take things slow. I'm not asking for anything to change tonight. I just wanted you to know." He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I'm glad you told me, because I need you to know something too." He set aside his blankets and moved closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes. What started as necessity sheltering you, marrying you'd, becomes something else for me too, something I wasn't expecting. What? Hope. For the first time in 8 years, I'm looking forward to tomorrow, instead of just getting through today. The honesty in his voice made her breath catch. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of his beard and the warmth of his skin. "Then we're both changing," she said softly. Ephraim covered her hand with his own, holding it against his face for a moment before gently pulling it away. "We are, but slowly, like you said, one day at a time." As he settled into his bedroll and she prepared for bed, Lydia felt something new settling into her chest. Not love yet, it was too soon for that, but the foundation on which love might grow. Trust, respect, affection, and the sweet possibility of more to come. Outside, the wind whispered through the mountains, carrying the promise of winter and the scent of snow. But inside their cabin, warmth radiated from more than just the fire. Two hearts that had been wounded and solitary were slowly learning to beat in harmony, creating something neither had expected, but both were beginning to treasure. Lydia's first week of teaching passed in a blur of lesson plans, eager young faces, and the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. The children were bright and hungry for learning, and their families welcomed her with genuine warmth. By Thursday evening, when she returned to the ranch, she felt more like herself than she had in years. Ephraim was waiting for her with dinner ready and stories about his week. They fell into easy conversation about her students and his cattle, sharing the comfortable intimacy of a couple who were learning to be partners in all things. It was the following Tuesday, during her second week of teaching, that everything changed. Lydia was in the middle of a geography lesson when she heard horses approaching the schoolhouse. Through the window she could see 3 ridersmen in dark suits who looked official and serious. Her stomach tightened with unease, but she continued with the lesson until a sharp knock at the door interrupted her. "Children, please work quietly on your slate exercises while I see who's calling." The man at the door was middle-aged and stern-faced, with a badge pinned to his vest and papers in his hand. Behind him stood 2 other men she recognized as the lawyer from Bent Creek, the other a stranger, with cold eyes and expensive clothes. "Mrs. Boone, I'm Marshall Hawkins. I need to speak with you about your husband's property claims." "My husband isn't here. He's at the ranch." "That's why we've come to you, ma'am. These gentlemen have some questions about the legitimacy of Mr. Boone's land ownership, and we thought you might be able to help clear things up." Lydia's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" The lawyer stepped forward, unfolding a document that looked official and important. "Mrs. Boone, according to our research, there may be some irregularities in your husband's original claim to the land currently known as the Boone Ranch." "What sort of irregularities?" "The kind that suggest the land was never legally his to claim in the first place." The third man, the one she didn't recognize, spoke up. "Mrs. Boone, I represent the Consolidated Cattle Syndicate. We've been conducting a thorough review of land ownership in this valley, and we've discovered some concerning discrepancies in the documentation supporting your husband's claim." "I don't understand. Ephraim has owned that land for 8 years. He's filed all the proper papers, paid all the taxes." "That's just it, ma'am," the marshal said, not unkindly. "The original homestead claim that Mr. Boone based his ownership on it appears to have been fraudulent." Lydia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "That's impossible." The lawyer spread the document on a nearby desk, pointing to various sections. "This is a copy of the original filing, supposedly made by one Marcus Brennan in 1867. But according to territorial records, Marcus Brennan died in a mining accident in 1865, 2 years before this claim was filed. Someone used a dead man's name to establish the claim," the syndicate representative added smoothly, "which means the land has been illegally occupied for nearly a decade. But Ephraim bought the claim from Brennan. He has a bill of sale." "From a man who was already dead, Mrs. Boone, which makes the transaction invalid from the beginning." Lydia's mind raced, trying to understand the implications. "What are you saying exactly?" We're saying that your husband has no legal right to the land he's been living on, the marshal said, and that the Consolidated Cattle Syndicate, having done the proper research and filed the appropriate claims, is the rightful owner. This is ridiculous. You can't just come in here and steal someone's land based on paperwork irregularities. It's not theft, ma'am, the lawyer said. It's following the law. If the original claim was fraudulent, then everything that followed from it is null and void. The syndicate man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Of course, we're reasonable people. We understand that your husband has invested time and money into developing the property. We're prepared to offer compensation for the improvements he's made, say, $10,000 for his trouble. $10,000. A fortune for most people, but a fraction of what the land was truly worth, and nowhere near the $75,000 they'd offered when they thought they had to buy it legitimately. Does my husband know about this? Lydia asked. We thought it might be easier to discuss the situation with you first, the marshal said. Sometimes a woman's perspective can help a man see reason. The condescension in his tone made her anger flare. My husband is a reasonable man, Marshal Hawkins, but he's also not a fool. He won't give up his life's work based on some convenient paperwork you've produced. Mrs. Boone, the syndicate representative said, his voice taking on a harder edge, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. If your husband refuses to cooperate, he'll be forcibly removed from land that legally belongs to someone else. That's called trespassing, and it's a crime that can result in imprisonment. And what about me? What about our marriage, our home? Unfortunate casualties of your husband's poor judgment, I'm afraid. Of course, if you were to help us convince him to accept our generous offer. Get out. Lydia's voice was low and dangerous. Get out of this schoolhouse right now. Mrs. Boone. I said get out. These children don't need to hear any more of your threats and lies. The marshal tipped his hat. We'll be in touch, ma'am. I suggest you discuss this with your husband. The law is the law, whether we like it or not. After they left, Lydia stood in the empty doorway, her hands shaking with rage and fear. The children, sensing something was wrong, worked quietly at their desks while she struggled to regain her composure. She dismissed school early, claiming a sudden headache, and rode hard for the ranch. Her mind churned with questions and possibilities, all of them bad. Could the documents be real? Could Ephraim really have built his life on fraudulent land claims? Or was this all an elaborate scheme by the syndicate to steal what they couldn't buy? She found Ephraim in the barn, repairing tack. One look at her face told him something was seriously wrong. What happened? She told him everything, watching his expression grow darker with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the leather he'd been mending. The claim papers, he said finally. I need to look at them again. They went into the cabin, where Ephraim pulled out a wooden box from under the bed. Inside were various documents, marriage certificate, tax records, and a folder containing the papers related to his land purchase. He spread the bill of sale on the table, studying it with new eyes. I bought this claim from Marcus Brennan in Denver 8 years ago. Met him in a saloon. Seemed like an honest man who needed money more than he needed land. But if he was already dead, then either I met a ghost or someone was impersonating him. Ephraim's jaw tightened. Someone who knew enough about the original claim to forge the paperwork convincingly. Could you have been tricked? Easily. I was young and eager, and probably too trusting. If someone wanted to sell me fraudulent papers, I wouldn't have known the difference. Lydia felt sick. Everything they'd built, everything they were planning for the future, it could all be built on lies and deception. What do we do? First, we find out if their documents are real. Then we figure out how to fight this. And if we can't fight it, Ephraim was quiet for a moment, then reached out to take her hand. Then we start over somewhere else, together. But this is your home. You've worked so hard. Lydia, 8 years ago I came here with nothing but what I could carry. If I have to do it again, at least this time I won't be alone. The strength in his voice, the certainty that they would face whatever came together, made her eyes burn with unshed tears. I'm so sorry. If I hadn't pushed you to tell me about your past, if I hadn't... This isn't your fault. It's mine for not being more careful when I bought this land, for trusting a stranger in a saloon instead of verifying the paperwork properly. That night, they sat by the fire planning their next moves. They would ride to the territorial office in Colorado Springs, examine the original records, and find out exactly what they were dealing with. They would fight the syndicate's claims with every legal means at their disposal. But as Lydia lay in bed, listening to Ephraim move restlessly around the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The syndicate had come prepared with documents, lawyers, and marshals. They had money and influence and the apparent backing of the law. All she and Ephraim had was their love for the land and each other. Sometimes that was enough to move mountains. Sometimes it wasn't enough to stop them from falling. The ride to Colorado Springs took 2 days of hard travel, but Lydia and Ephraim pushed through without complaint. Every hour that passed felt like time slipping away from them, and the weight of uncertainty pressed down like an approaching storm. The territorial office was an imposing stone building that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic indifference. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledgers with barely concealed irritation when they approached his desk. "We need to examine the original homestead records for Section 12, Township 15 North, Range 68 West," Ephraim said, producing his own papers as reference. The clerk sighed dramatically. "That'll take some time to locate. You'll need to wait." "How much time?" "Could be an hour, could be 3. Depends on where the files ended up." They waited and waited. The hours stretched interminably, while Lydia tried to read and Ephraim paced the small waiting area like a caged wolf. Other petitioners came and went, some leaving with satisfied expressions, others with the same grim worry that she and Ephraim carried. Finally, near closing time, the clerk returned with a thick folder. "Section 12, Township 15 North. These are the original filings." Ephraim's hands were steady as he opened the folder, but Lydia could see the tension in his shoulders. The first document was indeed a homestead claim filed by Marcus Brennan, dated June 15, 1867. The signature looked authentic, the paperwork properly notarized. But tucked behind it was another document that made Ephraim's blood run cold: a death certificate for Marcus Brennan, dated March 3, 1865, 2 years before the homestead claim was filed. "Someone filed this claim using a dead man's name," Lydia whispered. "And I bought it from them 8 years later, thinking I was dealing with the original claimant." Ephraim's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. "I was a fool." "You were trusting," Lydia corrected. "There's a difference." The clerk was watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Problem with your paperwork?" "You could say that," Ephraim said grimly. "What happens when a homestead claim is proven fraudulent?" "Well, the land reverts to territorial ownership and can be claimed by the next legitimate applicant. Course, that's assuming someone files the proper challenges and can prove their case in court." "And who filed the challenge to this claim?" The clerk consulted his records. "The Consolidated Cattle Syndicate filed their papers last month, along with a new claim for the same section." Lydia felt sick. The syndicate hadn't just discovered the fraud, they'd orchestrated this entire situation. "How long do we have before the land officially transfers to them?" "Hearings scheduled for next week. If the current occupant, that be you, I reckon, doesn't appear to contest the challenge, the transfer becomes automatic." "What would we need to contest it successfully?" "Proof that you have a superior claim to the land, or evidence that the syndicate's challenge is itself fraudulent." The clerk shrugged. "Either way, you'd need a lawyer and considerable documentation." That evening, in a modest hotel room that cost more than Lydia usually spent on food in a week, they spread out their options like cards in a losing hand. The legal facts were stark and unforgiving. Ephraim's claim was based on fraudulent documents, and the syndicate had followed proper procedures in challenging it. "There has to be something we're missing," Lydia said, poring over the papers for the dozenth time. Some way to prove that the syndicate knew about the fraud when they offered to buy the land. Knowing about fraud and proving they orchestrated it are two different things, Ephraim said. He sat heavily in the room's single chair, looking older than his 34 years. Face it, Lydia, we're beaten. I don't accept that. You may have to. No, her voice was fierce with determination. I won't let them steal our home. There has to be another way. That night, as Ephraim slept fitfully, Lydia lay awake thinking about everything they'd learned. The syndicate's confidence, their prepared documents, the convenient timing of their challenge it, all felt too orchestrated to be coincidence. An idea began to form, dangerous and desperate, but possibly their only chance. The next morning, she shared her plan with Ephraim over breakfast in the hotel's small dining room. What if we can prove that someone in the syndicate was involved in the original fraud? What if Marcus Brennan didn't just happen to die before someone filed a claim in his name? That was 8 years ago, Lydia. Even if we could prove a connection, finding evidence after all this time would be almost impossible. Almost. She leaned forward, her voice urgent. But what if the evidence still exists? What if whoever orchestrated this kept records? Where would we even begin to look? With the man who sold you the claim, you said you met him in a Denver saloon. What if he wasn't the mastermind but just a front man? What if he's still alive and willing to talk? Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, considering. It's a long shot. It's the only shot we have. They spent the day in Denver, visiting the saloons and gambling houses where desperate men gathered to sell whatever they had left. Most of the bartenders and regulars were new, but finally, in a rundown establishment near the stockyards, they found someone who remembered. Marcus Brennan? Sure, I knew him, said an old-timer nursing a whiskey that looked like it might be his breakfast. Used to come in here regular-like, always talking about some big score he was working on. Haven't seen him in, must be 6, 7 years now. Did he ever mention land deals, homestead claims? The old man's eyes sharpened with interest. You law? Because if you are, I don't know nothing about nothing. We're not law, Ephraim said, sliding a silver dollar across the table. We're just people who got cheated and are trying to make it right. Well, in that case, yeah. Marcus used to brag about how he'd figured out a way to make money off dead men's dreams. Said he had a partner with connections in the territorial office, someone who could make paperwork appear and disappear as needed. Lydia's pulse quickened. Did he ever mention this partner's name? Called him the Colonel, but I always figured that was just a nickname. Military man, supposedly. Had money and influence and a taste for schemes that walked right up to the edge of legal. What did this Colonel look like? Never saw him myself, but Marcus described him once. Older fellow, silver hair, expensive clothes. The kind of man who looked like he belonged in fancy hotels and exclusive clubs. Lydia and Ephraim exchanged glances. The description matched perfectly with the older syndicate representative who had visited their ranch. This Colonel, Ephraim said carefully, did Marcus ever say what his real name was? The old-timer scratched his stubbled chin. Funny you should ask. Last time I saw Marcus, he was drunk as a lord and bragging about how his partner was making big moves. Said the Colonel was putting together some kind of cattle operation, buying up land all over Colorado. Called him by name that night. What was it? He closed his eyes, concentrating. Hamilton. Colonel Hamilton. They left the saloon with more hope than they'd felt in days, but also with the sobering knowledge that they still had no proof. A drunk man's ramblings in a dingy bar wouldn't hold up in court, especially against a man with the resources and connections that Colonel Hamilton apparently possessed. We need something concrete, Lydia said as they walked back toward their hotel. Documents, witnesses, something that directly links Hamilton to the fraudulent claims. Where would we find that? I don't know, but I know where we need to start looking. That afternoon, they made their way to the finest hotel in Denver, the kind of establishment where men like Colonel Hamilton would stay when conducting business. The lobby was all marble and crystal, designed to impress and intimidate. Lydia approached the desk clerk with her most charming smile. "Excuse me, I'm trying to locate an old family friend. Colonel Hamilton?" He would have stayed here periodically over the past several years. The clerk's expression was professionally neutral. "I'm sorry, miss, but we don't discuss our guests' comings and goings." "Of course not. I wouldn't want you to violate anyone's privacy. It's just that we've lost touch, and I was hoping—" "Lydia?" The voice came from behind them, and both she and Ephraim turned to see a familiar figure approaching. It was Tom Carson from Bent Creek, looking as surprised to see them as they were to see him. "Tom, what brings you to Denver?" "Business with the Cattle Association." "But what are you two doing here? Shouldn't you be teaching school and tending cattle?" Ephraim and Lydia exchanged glances. Tom was a friend, but this situation was delicate. How much could they trust him with? "We're dealing with some legal issues regarding the ranch," Ephraim said carefully. "Land ownership matters." Tom's expression darkened. "Let me guess, the Consolidated Cattle Syndicate. You know about them?" "Know about them. I've been fighting them for months. They've made offers on half the ranches in our area, and when people refuse to sell, strange things start happening. Equipment breaks, cattle go missing, legal challenges appear out of nowhere." "Legal challenges?" "My neighbor, Pete Morrison, remember him? He's been farming his land for 15 years, but last month the syndicate claimed his original deed was improperly filed. Took him to court and won. Pete lost everything." Lydia felt her heart sink. If the syndicate was using similar tactics against multiple ranchers, it suggested a coordinated campaign of legal fraud that would be almost impossible to fight. "Tom," she said urgently, "the man behind this, do you know his name?" "Hamilton. Colonel Robert Hamilton, though some say that's not his real name either. Used to be military, but got kicked out for some kind of scandal. Now he uses his knowledge of bureaucracy and record-keeping to find loopholes and create them when they don't exist. Where would we find him?" Tom looked around the luxurious lobby meaningfully. "If he's in town, he'll be here. This is where all the cattle barons stay when they're making deals." "Is he here now?" "Was yesterday. Saw him in the restaurant with some territorial officials and a couple of judges. Looked like they were having themselves a fine old time." The implications hit Lydia like a physical blow. If Hamilton had judges and territorial officials in his pocket, then fighting him through legal channels might be hopeless. They needed something bigger, something that would expose the entire conspiracy. "Tom," Ephraim said, "if we could prove that Hamilton has been systematically defrauding ranchers throughout Colorado, would that be enough to stop him?" "More than enough. The territorial governor's been under pressure from Washington to clean up land fraud. If he had evidence of a widespread conspiracy, then we need to get that evidence," Lydia said firmly, "whatever it takes." As they left the hotel and walked through the busy Denver streets, Lydia's mind was racing with possibilities. Somewhere in this city, Colonel Hamilton had an office or a residence where he kept the records of his schemes. Somewhere there were documents that would prove his connection to fraudulent land claims throughout Colorado. Finding those documents would be dangerous, possibly illegal, and almost certainly their only chance of saving their home. "Lydia," Ephraim said quietly as they reached their own modest hotel, "what you're thinking, it's too risky. If we're caught, if we don't try, we lose everything anyway." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with determination. "I won't let them destroy what we've built. I won't let them win." Ephraim looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we'd better figure out how to do this right, because we'll only get one chance." That night, as they planned what might be the most important burglary in Colorado Territory history, Lydia thought about the promise she'd made on that desperate day when she'd arrived at Ephraim's ranch. 10 sons, a future built on love and hope and hard work. She'd be damned if she'd let Colonel Hamilton steal that future without a fight. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. While Ephraim created a distraction in the hotel's main dining room, Lydia would slip upstairs to Hamilton's suite and search for evidence of his fraudulent schemes. They had one advantage Tom Carson had overheard, Hamilton telling the desk clerk he would be dining with associates until late that evening. Lydia dressed carefully in her finest clothes, hoping to blend in with the hotel's wealthy clientele. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked through the marble lobby, every eye seeming to follow her movement toward the grand staircase. Ephraim's distraction worked perfectly. The sound of raised voices and breaking crockery from the dining room drew the attention of staff and guests alike, giving Lydia the cover she needed to slip up to the third floor. Hamilton's suite was at the end of the hall, its mahogany door bearing a brass nameplate that read Colonel R. Hamilton. Lydia's hands shook as she tried, the handle locked, of course. But growing up on a farm had taught her many practical skills, including how to pick simple locks with a hairpin. The lock yielded after several agonizing minutes, and she slipped inside. The suite was everything she'd expected: luxurious furnishings, expensive artwork, and the kind of casual wealth that spoke of ill-gotten gains. But it was the large desk by the window that drew her attention. The desktop was neat and organized, with stacks of correspondence and legal documents arranged in precise piles. Lydia began searching systematically, her movements growing more frantic as precious minutes ticked away. Most of the papers were legitimate business correspondence, but finally, in a locked drawer that yielded to the same hairpin technique, she found what she was looking for. A leather portfolio containing dozens of land documents, all bearing signatures from dead men. Marcus Brennan was just one name. Among many, the portfolio contained fraudulent homestead claims spanning nearly a decade, each one transferring valuable land to various shell companies that ultimately traced back to Hamilton's operation. But it was the document at the bottom of the portfolio that made her breath catch. A letter from Hamilton to an associate, written just 6 months ago, that laid out the entire scheme with damning clarity. The Boone property will require more delicate handling. The current occupant has significant support in the local community, and direct intimidation may backfire. Suggest we proceed with the fraudulent claim challenge, as discussed. Once we've established legal precedent with his case, the remaining holdouts should fall in line quickly. It was signed with Hamilton's distinctive flourish and bore the letterhead of the Consolidated Cattle Syndicate. Lydia's hands trembled as she folded the letter and slipped it into her bodice, along with several other incriminating documents. This was the proof they needed: evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and Hamilton's direct involvement in stealing their land. She was preparing to leave when she heard voices in the hallway outside. Hamilton's voice, distinctive and commanding, was approaching along with at least 2 other men. Should have the Boone matter resolved by week's end. Once we establish the precedent there, the remaining properties will fall like dominoes. Panic shot through Lydia as she realized they were heading straight for the suite. She looked around desperately for another exit, but the only window opened onto a 3-story drop to the street below. The voices were getting closer, keys jingling as Hamilton prepared to unlock his door. In desperation, Lydia slipped behind the heavy draperies that framed the window, pressing herself against the glass and trying to control her breathing. The fabric was thick enough to hide her silhouette, but if anyone looked closely, the door opened and Hamilton entered with 2 companions. Through a gap in the drapery, Lydia could see him clearly for the first time. He was exactly as the old drunk had described: silver-haired, expensively dressed, with the bearing of a man accustomed to power and deference. "Gentlemen," Hamilton said, pouring drinks from a crystal decanter, "to the success of our enterprise, by Christmas we'll control more than 500,000 acres of prime grazing land." "What about resistance from the local authorities?" asked one of his companions, a thin man with a nervous manner. "Bought and paid for, most of them. The few honest officials can be managed through proper channels." Hamilton's smile was cold. "The beauty of this scheme is its legal veneer. We're not stealing land, we're simply correcting historical irregularities. And if someone discovers the truth, who would believe it? A handful of dirt farmers and small ranchers against the word of respected businessmen and territorial officials. The system protects those who understand how to use it." Lydia listened in growing horror as Hamilton outlined the scope of his conspiracy. It wasn't just about her and Ephraim's ranch. Hamilton was systematically defrauding ranchers throughout Colorado, using his knowledge of bureaucratic loopholes to steal millions of dollars worth of land. There is one potential complication, Hamilton continued. The Boone woman has been asking questions in town, and her husband has connections to some of the other affected parties. If they organize resistance, then we'll handle them the same way we handled Peterson and Martinez, the third man said with casual brutality. What happened to Peterson and Martinez? The nervous man asked. Peterson's barn caught fire, lost most of his equipment and his winter feed. Martinez had problems with his someone, contaminated it with something that made his cattle sick. Both sold to us at considerable loss, rather than face complete ruin. Lydia pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. They weren't just stealing land, they were using sabotage and intimidation to force compliance. How many families had they destroyed in pursuit of their empire? The men continued talking for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Hamilton's companions prepared to leave, and Lydia heard them moving toward the door. Remember, Hamilton said, the hearing is scheduled for Monday. I want everything in place before then. Once we have legal ownership of the Boone property, the others will fall quickly. The door closed, and Lydia heard Hamilton moving around the suite. She remained frozen behind the draperies, not daring to move until she was certain he had settled elsewhere in the room. Through the gap in the fabric, she could see him at his desk, writing in a ledger with meticulous care. This was her chance. If she could slip out while he was focused on his work. The floorboard creaked under her foot. Hamilton's head snapped up, his eyes immediately focusing on the draperies where she was hidden. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other through the fabric. Then Hamilton smiled, a predator's smile that made her blood turn to ice. "Well, well," he said softly, rising from his chair. "It seems we have an uninvited guest." Lydia stepped out from behind the draperies with as much dignity as she could muster, her chin lifted despite the terror coursing through her veins. Hamilton stood between her and the door, his expensive suit and cultured manner doing nothing to hide the dangerous calculation in his eyes. "Mrs. Boone, I presume, you're quite a long way from your little schoolhouse." "Colonel Hamilton." She kept her voice steady, though her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I was looking for you." "Were you indeed? And what exactly were you hoping to find?" "The truth about what you've done to my husband's land, what you've done to all the ranchers in our area." Hamilton walked slowly around his desk, never taking his eyes off her. "The truth, Mrs. Boone, is that your husband has been illegally occupying land that never belonged to him. I'm simply correcting a long-standing irregularity. By using documents from dead men, by bribing officials and intimidating families. Those are serious accusations. Do you have any proof?" Lydia's hand moved instinctively toward her bodice, where the stolen documents were hidden, but she caught herself before revealing their location. "I know what I heard tonight. You and your associates discussing sabotage, arson, contaminated wells, hearsay and speculation." Hamilton's smile was cold as winter wind. "Even if such a conversation had taken place, which I neither confirm nor deny, it would be your word against mine. And who do you think the authorities would believe? They'd believe evidence, documentation, proof of your conspiracy." "What evidence? What documentation?" Hamilton was closer now, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and see the calculation in his pale blue eyes. If such materials existed, they would be carefully guarded by men who understand their value. Not carefully enough. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Hamilton's expression sharpened instantly. "Ah, so you weren't simply visiting to chat." His gaze swept over her systematically, taking in every detail of her appearance. "The question is, what did you find, and where are you hiding it?" "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do. You're a school teacher, Mrs. Boone, an educated woman who understands the power of written evidence. If you went to the trouble of breaking into my private suite, you didn't leave empty-handed." He began walking toward her again, and Lydia backed away until she felt the window glass against her shoulders. "Stay away from me." I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, if you've taken something that belongs to me, I'll need it back. And if you've seen things you weren't meant to see, well, that presents a problem that needs solving. My husband knows where I am. If I don't return, your husband is currently being questioned by hotel security about the disturbance he caused in the dining room. Apparently, several witnesses saw him behaving erratically and making threats against other guests. Very troubling behavior for a man under investigation for land fraud. Lydia's blood turned to ice. They'd walked straight into a trap. While she'd been stealing documents, Hamilton's people had been setting Ephraim up to take the blame for whatever happened to her. Now then, Hamilton continued, I'm going to ask you politely to return what you've taken. Cooperation will make this much easier for everyone involved. And if I refuse, then I'll be forced to search you myself. And I assure you, Mrs. Boone, I'm very thorough in my searches. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Lydia's mind raced, looking for options, for escape routes, for anything that might save her from this situation. The stolen documents pressed against her ribs like a burning coal proof of Hamilton's crimes, but useless if she couldn't get them to the right people. You can't intimidate everyone forever, she said, stalling for time. People will figure out what you're doing. People believe what they're told to believe by men in positions of authority. And I have considerable influence with such men. Hamilton reached into his jacket and withdrew a small pistol, its nickel plating gleaming in the lamplight. Now, the documents. I won't ask again. At that moment, the suite door burst open. Ephraim filled the doorway like an avenging angel, his eyes taking in the scene instantly. Lydia pressed against the window, Hamilton with a gun in his hand. His face went dark with rage. Step away from my wife. Hamilton swung the pistol toward Ephraim, but he'd underestimated the big man's speed. Ephraim crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his hand clamping down on Hamilton's wrist with crushing force. The gun discharged into the ceiling, plaster raining down as the 2 men struggled. Lydia, get out of here, Ephraim shouted. But instead of running, Lydia grabbed the crystal decanter from Hamilton's sideboard and brought it down hard on the back of his head. Hamilton crumpled to the floor, the pistol spinning away across the expensive carpet. For a moment, they stood in the sudden silence, breathing hard and staring at the unconscious man at their feet. Are you hurt? Ephraim asked, pulling her into his arms. No, I'm fine. But Ephraim, I found proof of everything. Documents, letters, records of all the fraudulent claims. She pulled the papers from her bodice, her hands shaking with adrenaline. This will expose the entire conspiracy. Ephraim looked at the documents, then at Hamilton's still form. We need to get these to the territorial governor immediately, before Hamilton's people realize what's happened. How? You said hotel security was questioning you. I convinced them I was having a domestic dispute with my wife and needed to find you to apologize. Took some doing, but they let me go. He gathered up the scattered papers and additional documents from Hamilton's desk. Tom Carson is waiting downstairs with a wagon. He's going to help us get to the governor's office. They made their way quickly through the hotel, avoiding the main lobby where Hamilton's associates might be waiting. Tom was indeed outside with a wagon, his face grim with determination. Did you find what you needed? He asked as they climbed aboard. More than we needed, Lydia said, clutching the documents. Enough to bring down Hamilton and everyone working with him. The ride to the territorial capitol building was tense, every shadow potentially hiding Hamilton's men. But they reached the imposing stone structure without incident, and Tom's connections in the Cattle Association got them an emergency audience with Governor Evans himself. Governor Evans was a stern man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who'd fought his way up through territorial politics. He listened to their story with growing anger, examining the stolen documents with the eye of someone who understood both law and corruption. This is damning, he said finally. If these documents are authentic and they appear to be then Colonel Hamilton and his associates have perpetrated one of the largest land fraud schemes in territorial history. What happens now? Ephraim asked. Now I issue warrants for Hamilton and his known associates. We'll seize all consolidated cattle syndicate assets and begin the process of returning stolen land to its rightful owners." The governor's expression was granite hard. "I've been under pressure from Washington to clean up land fraud in Colorado. Mr. Hamilton has just provided me with the perfect opportunity to do exactly that." As they left the Capitol building in the pre-dawn darkness, Lydia felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The documents were in the right hands, justice would be served, and their home was safe. "It's over," she said, leaning against Ephraim's solid warmth as they rode back toward their hotel. "Not quite," Ephraim said. "We still have to testify, help with the investigation, make sure Hamilton and his people are properly prosecuted. But our land is safe?" "Our land is safe." He pulled her closer, his voice warm with emotion. "Thanks to you. I never would have thought to look for that kind of evidence. I told you I was a good partner. The best." Ephraim's kiss was soft and full of promise. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Boone?" Home. The word had never sounded so sweet. 6 months later, spring was painting Devil's Backbone Ridge in shades of green and gold. Lydia knelt in the garden beside their cabin, carefully tending the wild rosebush she'd planted by the front door. Its branches were thick with buds that would soon burst into fragrant blooms. Promise kept, a symbol of new life taking root in ground that had been fallow for too long. The legal proceedings had taken months to resolve, but justice had finally been served. Colonel Hamilton was facing 20 years in territorial prison for land fraud, along with most of his associates. The stolen properties had been returned to their rightful owners, and the consolidated cattle syndicate had been dissolved entirely. More importantly for their immediate future, Ephraim's ownership of the ranch had been confirmed beyond any doubt. Governor Evans had personally overseen the filing of new, legitimate papers that would stand up to any future challenges. "How's our patient doing?" Ephraim asked, settling beside her on the warm earth. Lydia smiled, one hand moving instinctively to the gentle curve of her belly. At 4 months along, her pregnancy was just beginning to show, but the new life growing inside her felt as real and precious as the roses they were nurturing. "Active," she said. "I think this one's going to be as restless as his father." "His? You're so certain it's a boy?" "Just a feeling, though I have to admit the idea of 9 more after this one is a bit daunting." Ephraim laughed, the sound rich and warm in the mountain air. "We don't have to hold you to that particular promise, you know. I'm finding that one Lydia Boone is worth more than 10 of anyone else." "Careful, Mr. Boone. That kind of talk might go to my head." "Good. I want it to." He leaned over to kiss her temple, his hand covering hers on her belly. "I want you to know exactly how precious you are to me." The transformation in their relationship had been gradual but profound. What had started as a desperate bargain had grown into something deeper and more lasting than either of them had dared hope. They were partners in every sense, working together to build their ranch, supporting each other's dreams, and slowly, carefully, building a love that would last a lifetime. Lydia continued teaching 3 days a week, and her school had become something of a model for rural education in Colorado Territory. The children adored her, and their parents respected her dedication to giving their sons and daughters the kind of education that would open doors to a wider world. Ephraim had expanded the ranch's operations, taking advantage of the railroad's arrival to ship cattle to eastern markets. The land that Hamilton had tried to steal was now providing them with prosperity beyond anything Lydia had imagined when she'd first stumbled to their door with nothing but desperation and determination. "I finished it yesterday," Ephraim said quietly, his voice carrying a note of shy pride. "Finished what?" Instead of answering, he stood and helped her to her feet, then led her toward the barn. Inside, in the corner where the old unfinished cradle had gathered dust for so many years, sat something beautiful enough to take her breath away. The new cradle was a masterpiece of woodworking, carved from the same oak tree that shaded their cabin. Every line was perfect, every joint seamless. The headboard bore a delicate pattern of roses and vines, and the rockers were shaped to provide the gentlest, most soothing motion. "Oh, Ephraim," she whispered, running her fingers over the silky wood. "It's beautiful. I wanted our child to have something made with love from the very beginning, something that would last for generations." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, not sadness, but overwhelming gratitude for the life they'd built together. The cradle represented so much more than just a place for their baby to sleep. It was a symbol of hope fulfilled, of dreams taking concrete form, of a future that stretched ahead of them bright with possibility. "There's something else," Ephraim said, pulling a small wrapped package from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band, sized to fit over her wedding ring. But this band was different. It was engraved with tiny roses that matched the pattern on the cradle, and inside, new words had been inscribed: EBLB, forever and always. "I thought you might want something that was just ours," he said as he slipped it onto her finger, "not from duty or desperation, but from love." "I love you too," she said, the words coming easily now, naturally like water flowing downhill, "more than I ever thought possible." As they stood together in the barn, surrounded by the evidence of Ephraim's skill and care, Lydia thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd arrived at this ranch with nothing but a desperate promise and a threadbare shawl. Now she had a home, a husband who cherished her, a child on the way, and a future full of promise. "Do you think our son will want to be a rancher?" she asked, leaning into Ephraim's warmth. "He can be whatever he wants to be, rancher, teacher, lawyer, doctor, anything that makes him happy." Ephraim's voice was firm with conviction. "That's the gift we're giving him, choices, the freedom to make his own way in the world. And if he wants 10 brothers and sisters to keep him company, then we'll see what we can do about that, though I'm thinking we might want to take it one at a time." That evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Lydia opened the leather journal Ephraim had given her when she'd started teaching again. She'd been keeping a record of their life together, not just lesson plans and daily schedules, but the small moments that made up a marriage. The first time Ephraim had told her he loved her. The day they'd learned about the baby. The quiet conversations and shared laughter that had woven their lives together like threads in a tapestry. Now she wrote about the cradle and the new ring and the roses blooming by their door. She wrote about the way Ephraim's face had lit up when he'd talked about their child's future, and the way her own heart had swelled with love and gratitude for the life they'd built together. "What are you writing?" Ephraim asked, settling beside her on the porch swing he'd built for evenings like this. "Our story, for our children and their children, so they'll know how we found each other." "And what story are you telling them?" Lydia smiled, her hand moving to rest on her growing belly. "That sometimes the best things in life come from the most desperate moments, that love can grow anywhere if you tend it with care and patience, and that promises made in faith and hope, even the most impossible ones, shave a way of coming true." Outside, the wind whispered through the mountains, carrying the scent of roses and the promise of summer. Inside their hearts, love bloomed like flowers in fertile ground, nurtured by trust and watered by tears of joy. The desperate woman who had promised 10 sons to a lonely cowboy had become a beloved wife and expectant mother. The giant of a man who had thought himself beyond redemption had found grace in unexpected places. And together, they had built something more precious than all the gold in Colorado Territory, a home where love could flourish and dreams could take root and grow into something beautiful enough to last forever. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly in the evening air, and the sound carried with it the contentment of creatures well tended and secure. It was the sound of prosperity earned through honest work, of land protected and preserved for future generations. It was the sound of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. It was the sound of home.